channels are catering to narrower audiences. And that means there's a lot of potential for good, but there are also dangers of fracture, extremism, and new forms of political capture. And lastly, there are open questions about how media and communication will be integrated into donor and practitioner governance strategies in the future. All of these are big questions that we hope we'll grapple with and perhaps answer during the course of the day. But first, we've got a short film to give you a flavour of how BBC Media Action uses media to increase accountability, reduce fragility, and help people understand and uphold their rights.
Media and communication is providing new ways for people to connect, reshaping patterns of political information, discussion, and behavior across the globe. BBC Media Action's work helps people from every part of society to make sense of events, engage in discussion, and take action to improve their lives. Last year, we partnered with over 100 media organizations to make more trusted, inclusive, and independent programs.
أنتجنا مع البي بي سي برنامج حول الكلام. لولا تلك الشراكة مع الكادر البي بي سي فما كانت هذه النتائج الطيبة.
شيء خطط الوزارة لتأهيل المعلم. خطة تدريب المعلمين أخذنا بدرب بالمدرسة الحكومية.
في هناك خطة لتطوير المعلم، يعني إيه خلي الجمهور يعرف إذا هذا موجود.
هذا ما نأمل في برنامج شباب البلد، وأيضا أسهمت في خلق جيل شاب أيضا قادر على الغوص في هذا الحوار ذات المساعدة.
हामीले नागरिक बहस सुरु गरेपछि हामीले यो कालिम्पोङ सामुदायिक रेडियोले 5-6 वर्षको अवधिमा 6 वर्षको अवधिमा ती नपाएको पहिचान 1.5 वर्षको अवधिमा पाएको छ र यहाँको नागरिकहरूले यहाँको जिम्मेवार अधिकारीहरूले चाहिँ कालिम्पोङ एफएम भन्दा पनि नागरिक बहसलाई चाहिँ उहाँले त्यसरी चिन्नुहुन्छ.
We work at scale. Last year, programs we supported reached over 100 million people. The programs empower people, open up space, and influence those in power.
We've seen the audience start their own WhatsApp groups, online discussions, and young people like me vote for their first time.
After Niambie, I knew that it is my right to participate in politics.
People who listen or watch BBC Media Action's programs know more, discuss more, and participate more in politics than people who don't.
We have a right to ask our councillors, our MPs to fulfill their promises.
People sharing their different opinions without raising their voice, without being aggressive. This might give like a good image to all Libyans that we can just have a normal discussion.
Our projects help women, the poor, the young or old, or those from minority ethnic, religious, or political groups get their voices heard.
فاميلي بدها شغل دومي كامي تخلص بمع كنا مرافق دوام فيلم برماد وزان مسلمان فرد دولا.
أنا كم ليس في شو دوام اللي دمقراط ولا درمانية ونور درما.
राजरकोटका निर्वाचित सांसद नेपाली कांग्रेसका राजीव विक्रम शाहलाई लिएर
मान्छे पुग्ने खाने सबै
के कुदो र केही नै यस्तै खानै नपुग्ने.
हाम्रो यथार्थ यहाँ छ. हामीले हाम्रो जनताको पीडा बुझ्दै नबुझेर हामी राजनीति गरिरहेका छौँ. यसले गर्दाखेरि हाम्रो राजनीति पनि बनिएको छैन, हाम्रो देश पनि बनिएको छैन.
Last year, 89% of our audience agreed programs were holding governments to account. How well societies understand and react to the challenges they face depends on the information available to them and how it's discussed. In every society, the media continues to play a critical role in that process.
So now on to today. Today's events aim to do two main things. Firstly, assess where we are on debates around media communication and governance, and what we should do as a community to improve the effectiveness of integration of media and communication into governance strategies. And secondly, reflect on the impact and lessons learned from implementing BBC Media Action's global grant the groundbreaking 5-year grant from DFID, concluding this summer. It delivered at scale, with programming supported by the grant watched or listened to by over 190 million people. The work operated in a wide variety of political systems and culture and various media, with different programming partners and theories of change in each country. But for each, there was a substantial research and learning component, and that allowed BBC Media Action to refine the programming and analyse the linkages between media participation and accountability at a scale few have tried before. It also provides a base of data and learning we're keen to share with colleagues. More to come in the second session. So let me hand over to Ruchira Shah, who's presenter of Radio 4's The World Tonight. And she's going to chair our opening panel, What Does Media Offer the Governance and Accountability Agenda?
Thank you, Caroline. Good morning. That's a phrase I don't say very often. I'm like a bat out of hell, blinking in the daylight. Welcome to this BBC Media Action debate, the first of what looks set to be a really interesting day. So we're going to be discussing, as Caroline was saying, what does the media offer the governance and accountability agenda? Better access to democracy, or just another arena in which to exert control of the political agenda? And of course, we're talking about this in a rapidly changing media context. The best illustration of the nature of this change is probably here in the first world. It probably hasn't escaped any of us that the man with his finger on the nuclear button chooses to communicate largely in capital letters with a liberal use of exclamation marks on something that I remember explaining not so long ago called Twitter. So if 140 characters passes for sophisticated political messaging from the White House, where does it really leave the rest of the world? What does that easier access to mass media mean for fragile and fractured states? Is the proliferation of media contributing to stability and greater transparency, or is it adding to the sense of a conflicted and divided political environment? And in this highly connected world, how can international support to media and communication contribute to better governance, making it more inclusive and more transparent? Well, those are some of the questions that we'll be addressing this morning. Let me introduce you to our panel. Angela Murithi is the Country Director in Kenya of BBC Media Action. Duncan Green is the Senior Strategic Advisor to Oxfam. Stephen King is the partner in the Omidyar Network, which invests in entrepreneurs, I think that's fair to say. And Thomas Hughes is Executive Director of Article 19, which champions freedom of expression. And there's proof, I hope, of the power of digital connections, or not, as the case may be, he is there. Louis-Philippe Lopez-Calva is co-director of the World Development Report 2017 at the World Bank, and he's joining us via Skype very early in the morning from Washington, DC. Thank you, Louis-Philippe. So welcome to all of you, and just to keep all of you in the loop, we're going to chat here on the panel for about an hour or so, and there should be time for some questions at the end, so do keep a note of any burning questions that you have. So let's begin by talking about that changing media context. In Europe and the US, there's lots of discussion about the decline of mainstream media, the proliferation of fake news as a way of influencing opinion and people existing really within an information echo chamber, only reading and absorbing the trends that reinforce their own worldview. Those trends have been linked with the way politics is being done here, a rise in populist or even post-truth politics. But how does that compare with what's happening in other parts of the world? Are those trends and changes being played out in Africa, Asia, and the Middle East? Angela, I'm going to come to you first because you have really good first-hand experience. Give us a picture of the changes that you're seeing in Kenya.
Yeah, thank you, Ruchira. Can you hear me? Yes, thanks. I think that there's quite a lot of media diversity in the developing world. We're talking about areas where people have no access to any media at all. These are media dark areas, to countries where there is media, quite a lot of media, mainstream media, TV and radio, but it's tightly controlled by the government, and areas where you have really liberal, vibrant, plural media, so a whole range of diversity of the media environment. At the same time, I think the developing world is kind of dealing with some of those vagaries that you've mentioned, because although we live in a developing context, we are also embracing modernization, and we're embracing these new media, social media, Twitter, Facebook, and we're having to deal with the same challenges that the developed world is dealing with. So we've got fake news, we've got social media, the echo chamber, people just talking to themselves, social media being used for nefarious purposes to try and push certain agendas, to recruit people into extremist groups. So we are faced with those similar challenges that people in the developed world are facing.
And in Kenya specifically, there have been some interesting examples of how the media's got involved with the political process. Yeah. Do you want to just give us a sense of that?
So I think that the media in Kenya is subject to quite a lot of political co-option, and business interests getting involved in the media so that they can achieve their own agendas. The president, for instance, actually owns quite a large chunk of the media in Kenya, owns a huge media organization called K24, and other people in the political field as well. So it's a kind of battleground for ideas, and politicians are using the media quite a lot to push their own agenda. In 2008, the media was involved or complicit in the violence that took place, especially vernacular stations, because the politics in our country tends to be quite ethnically charged, and vernacular stations are very, very popular. So the vernacular stations were kind of involved in quite a lot of sensationalist media. I mean, stories that got people engaged in violence. So I think there is the media is kind of a place where because information is power, everybody wants a chunk of it. The politicians, the business interests, and that's how it is at the moment.
Thomas Hughes, is the space for an exchange of ideas shrinking as the media expands?
I think, I mean, going back, if I can just jump in on the first question at the same time as answering the second one. I think we're seeing, and as Caroline outlined in her opening comments, we're seeing really a commonality of trends that are affecting the whole world at the same time. We're seeing the digital revolution making information much more available, decentralizing communication, empowering individuals. But at the same time, we're seeing an increase on, or the reflection of the human nature, but the increase of hate speech online. We're seeing state increasing digital surveillance. We're seeing increasing criminalization of content. We're seeing well-established models of journalism and professional ethics being rolled out throughout the world. But at the same time, we see the increase in, as you described, fake news, but propaganda and misinformation. We see a growth in the attacks on journalism and impunity, as UNESCO is documenting. We see the destabilization of traditional media models due to advertising, due to the advertising model being changed by the presence of the tech giants. We see growing access to information and transparency set against, as was pointed out, shrinking civic space, restrictions on registration, restrictions on financial transfers. And we also see a burgeoning and growing body of international expertise and standards being undermined at the national level or countered at the national level through chauvinistic foreign policy, through the scapegoating of multilateralism by national governments and so on. So all of these trends we see are affecting both the global north and the global south. But the impact of those trends between those different countries, and even by region actually, or within a region, is very, very different. So for instance, in Kenya, where there's quite a strong judiciary and certainly issues around ownership of media, but a strong judiciary that's willing to take a stand on different pieces of legislation, where a coalition of parliamentarians, media and civil society can come together and push back against something like the PDO Amendment Act. Those changes look, I think, more similar in the impact, let's say, to the global north than they do to more restrictive human rights environments, where if there isn't the presence of a strong judiciary, there isn't the presence of media, independent media, and so on and so forth, the impacts are more worrying. So going to the question, yes, I mean, we do see a diversification of availability of information. I think from a global north perspective, that often looks quite worrying because we focus around mass media and quality, trustworthy content, also as perceived trustworthy content. But actually the reality, I think, in many of the Global South countries is that those social media outlets and that proliferation actually creates that access to information, creates that diversity, and the co-option by commercial interests and by government of the mass media channels means that they have not been, and have for a long time never been, I can say that, trusted sources of information. So there's not one size fits all, it's not one interpretation.
Stephen King, your organisation works all over the world. What's your experience?
I think picking up on Angela's and Thomas's points, I mean, I think we're seeing a rise in populism and nativism, but this, I think, has obviously been sort of focused because of Trump's election and Brexit and sort of events we're seeing in Europe, but this is not a new trend by any means. I mean, if you look at the election of Duterte in the Philippines, and he was elected as part of a kind of a strong man side of politics, and the threats to sort of kill drug traffickers and so on and so forth are very much a sort of part of that. So we're seeing that these trends are happening everywhere. It's been put into focus because of the events in the US and Europe, but it's also something that we've seen evolving over a number of years as well. What I think is important is that we look at the sort of diversity of the kind of media models that are out there. So the kind of things that we support are both public service media and public good media, investigative journalism, but we also support for-profit digital media platforms as well. And we've invested about $30 million in the last sort of 5 years on those kind of things. And so, for example, in the Philippines, we've invested in a platform called Rappler, which is now the third most popular source of information. And it's both investigative and is independent. So then that provides a counterbalance to what you described in terms of the government-run and corporate-run media as well. So I think there are bright spots within this firmament. But I think everything that both Angela and Thomas have said is correct. And also I think then we've also got to lay on top of that the rise of social media, the siloization, the filter bubbles that people are seeing. And that's not just in the US and Europe, that is everywhere across the world.
And when you talk about creating digital platforms, perhaps is something we'll explore a little bit in more detail a little bit later. How much do you consider access? Is access to digital platforms the same everywhere?
No, of course, and Andrew and I were talking about this earlier in the context of Kenya. If you're talking about northwest rural Kenya, it's not. But in urban areas, particularly, most people now have access to mobile phones, and that's the sort of information point of choice. I mean, in Nigeria, for example, there's now more than 70 million people who have access to the internet. In Myanmar, where it started from a position 5 years ago where it cost $3,000 for a SIM card, now you've got something like 75% of the population.
That's just sinking in, yeah.
You've got 75% of the population who have access to mobile phones, and 80% of those have access to smartphones. So increasingly, people are becoming connected, and increasingly, people are getting their sources of information through mobile. Now, that's not to say that radio and TV is not important, because in many of the areas which you don't have the same access through the internet, radio and TV is absolutely the way that people consume their information.
Louis-Philippe, if I can bring you in, you've just overseen the World Development Report for 2017, and it included a big reference, I think, to the power and role of media and communication in development. And we'll talk about that in more detail in a moment. But first, this sort of overarching idea that in the West we're increasingly shutting ourselves off into putting ourselves into like-minded media spaces. Is that a danger then, from your perspective, for the rest of the world too?
Well, first of all, thank you for allowing me to participate in this conversation. I wanted to start by saying that if we, try to summarize what is the role of the World Development Report, like the one we prepared, what we try to do is to try to sort of take stock of what we have learned about an issue in the last 20 years, and we try to influence the way we think about this issue in the next 20 years. So I would like to bring a more long-term perspective, and we try to do it based on evidence about issues that we can be concerned about in the very short run. So the way I started by saying that the WDR could be helpful precisely when we talk about the role of the media and the role of, for example, the road to accountability, starting from information and strengthening accountability via what publicity. So what kind of information is made public and to whom. And that's why access, for example, matters. So how you reach the right audiences with the right type of information. But what we emphasize, and I want to start with this idea to develop perhaps later, is that every society development is a process that generates tensions in every society. And I think the important issue here is how societies adapt at the margin and process those tensions. So a lot of the concerns that we have in some countries that traditionally didn't have certain this type of tensions, OECD countries and so on, have been tensions that we have faced in the developing world for a long time. And what we try to see in the report is how to understand how societies adapt to those tensions when there is more role of more competition among the media, more capacity to help hold not only politicians accountable through the media, but also when there is competition to hold the media accountable to themselves through the competition. So I think this element of I would like to emphasize the idea that societies adapt in a more constructive, inclusive way, which is the main message of the report, when there is more competition with the media, more capacity of citizens to participate in the public debate and to shape the beliefs of others about the public discussion. So I think this more long-term perspective that we were trying to look at tells us that with as much evidence as we can gather, that actually the media play a fundamental role in allowing this adaptation capacity of every society to the tensions that are very natural with the process of development and sometimes can be threatening the stability of institutions.
Duncan, if we can pick up then directly from that idea, if development itself, in and of itself, is a source of tension, what role then does the media play, in your view, in influencing politics and the quality of governance?
I think, what we're seeing in the US and Europe now is actually stuff we've been seeing in many developing countries for decades.
Right.
So I was writing about telepopulism in Peru in the 90s. Yeah. Chacha Host becomes president, does lots of crazy stuff, shuts down parliament in Peru in the mid-90s. So this is not new. I think the way we're thinking about the role of information is slightly different now, and it reflects a lot of what the other panelists have said, which is we've given up on a sort of linear approach of these are the big media, you influence them, and therefore you influence society. It's something much more about, I'm sorry to sound a bit sort of wonky, but complex systems where you have so many different players interacting in so many different ways that there's no handle to pull. And then what you've got to understand is the dynamics of those systems, which actually underlies a lot of the stuff in the excellent media action briefings that we were sent beforehand, in terms of spotting critical junctures, moments of opportunity, alliances, aligning interests between different groups in society, and those alliances may be short-term, maybe long-term, thinking about really long-term stuff like how do social norms emerge. It's a very different way of thinking about the role of media in the evolution of society to thinking we just have to get something in the Financial Times or the Guardian and then we job done. And it's very interesting how much the papers are going in that direction at the moment.
But do you think, it's a complex picture that you're painting, do you think people listen? Is there the capacity to listen to so many diverse sources of information?
Well, there was a really interesting experience in Tanzania a couple of years ago where a brilliant NGO called Twaweza was doing mass media work. And they stood back and did a really sort of serious evaluation and found no impact at all. And then they, being a very good NGO, they then told the world, we've had no impact at all. Could everybody come and have a look at our lack of impact? I'm sure Oxfam would do the same in similar circumstances. And when we looked at it, the conclusion was it's all in the arrows. They had their theory of change diagram with if we do this, then we will do that. And there was this arrow. And one of the key arrows was if we get people access to information via the media, they will take action. And a group of people from Princeton identified 17 different assumptions behind that one arrow, such as people don't already know that schools are terrible. They need to be told this. And if they are told, they think that if they do something about schools, it'll have an effect, and on and on and on. So what's becoming clear is that it's not enough to just do access to information. It's much more about the alliances you build and the understanding of the specific history of the information ecosystem in each country, which is a more difficult job.
Angela, you were nodding along there.
Yeah, I think in a lot of the research we've been doing in Kenya, we've realized actually that it's not a linear pattern, that you don't just go from information direct to political participation, that actually the path can be quite organic and you have to pass through other kind of different places first before you get to the action that you desire. People need to know about things, people need to discuss things, the information needs to percolate. We can't assume that people are just passive agents and our work is just to pump them full of information and then off they go like zombies to do what we want. I think there has to be quite a lot of movement of information in the societies, and we really need to understand the information economy of the kind of places we work. So how does information flow and how is it normally used in the society to achieve change?
Yeah, I mean, to build on that, I mean, we funded a lot of projects, as many other people have, which have made an assumption that people will use technology to take particular action. You put some information out there on the budget on a mobile phone, and hey presto, people, things happen, and that just doesn't happen. People don't wake up in the morning to check their national budgets on their mobile phones. I certainly don't. I check the news, I check the sports scores, whatever. So, I mean, we also got to take a step back and really think about how people use information and what is it that drives them to demand change, and also where they're going to be most interested and most active. And it tends to be if it's something that affects the local area, if it's something that will personally affect them, their families, their children, and so on. So once we understand that, and that's part of the kind of the information ecosystem, then I think we're in a better place to design solutions. The other thing I think is also to think about the role of what we call the kind of infomediaries, so that it's not the ordinary person who's going to take action necessarily. It's also the civil society organisations, it's the lawyers, and so on. And it's so if you're providing people with access to information on national budgets, you can't assume that an ordinary villager is going to be interested. But where I think the media is important here is to interpret and make that information more accessible to people, to call out anomalies, to call out information which is corrupt or doesn't make sense. Why has that minister now got a fleet of 10 Mercedes? Why is this particular district getting all the kind of services and so on, but that district isn't? And that, I think, is a more sophisticated way to look at things.
Thomas, do you think about who has what information and how they might then use it?
Absolutely. And going back to the previous comments as well, I mean, it's something I think that the community that's working on this has identified a number of years ago. And, certainly Article 19, we've worked in Bangladesh looking at, with local environment groups, looking at the use of right to information to empower those groups to then demand access to different budgetary figures. We've done the same in Brazil around water, and in Kenya around IDPs and so on and so forth. So a number of different types of projects. And they're all sort of small, but they all bear quite a lot of fruit in terms of actual engagement, local change. But what I would say is that sometimes in discussions like this, we move very quickly away from the necessity to think about the legal framework. I think there is sometimes an assumption that that's been done, and the new trend must go on towards local engagement and how to use the information, which I agree with. But given what we just said before about changing environments, unless the legal frameworks themselves at the departure point allow for that information to be accessed, shared, and reproduced, then that ecosystem just doesn't exist afterwards.
So media laws, you're talking about in countries.
So I would say, right to information laws, but also whistleblower protection, data-related laws, source protection issues, so on and so forth. So there's a whole range of different, and e-governance as well, but a whole range of different pieces of legislation and policy that need to be there to create these systems that allow then both media, but also civil society and individuals to make use of that law. But I do completely agree, of course, that you can't just create a legal framework and then sit back and say, great,
and
that's going to be used.
I guess in my mind, there was an assumption that was always the danger in the past, that people kind of thought, we passed the law, the work is done.
I think that was the assumption a decade ago. I think that's the old assumption, that you create it and people will flock to the new opportunity that allows. And there's a realization now that a lot of organizations are trying to tap into and understand better, including BBC Media Action, is how do you then connect that? How do you take that right? How do you take that data set and actually make it usable and interpretable for a local community? And then how do you empower that community in terms of their participation to then actually feed that back up for a change on the ground? Because again, one thing is to make them aware and to create action around it, but that action then needs to lead to some kind of change.
Actually, I just want to come back to a couple of things that have come up during the course of the conversation about Kenya. We talked about how different people have different access to different kinds of media. And in Kenya, you might not have access to the internet in a rural, poor area. But equally, you've got a system that has an active judiciary, a judiciary that functions. Do you think then in your work about who is going to access what, who reads blogs, who looks at social media when you consider the kind of projects that you take on?
Yes, absolutely. I think before we begin any work in our organization, we tend to do quite a lot of research to understand the media environment, to understand who's accessing what and when, and how do they consume this information, and what information do they want, and how do they want it transmitted to them. So we do that in order to produce media outputs that are going to be effective and relevant and reach the target audiences that we're trying to reach. And a lot of times we found that there isn't one way of achieving our objective, that we usually have to use multiple platforms. We were just having this discussion in the morning about how multiple platforms using radio, television, mobile phone, community engagement can all work really well to achieve a certain positive outcome when it comes to governance. So I think understanding the media environment and the information economy is really, really important. And also maybe taking it a little bit further, which is what I think I would like us to be doing in Kenya, is just taking a kind of a political economy approach, because it's so important to understand who the winners and the losers are going to be, and who's going to gain, who's got vested interests, who are the spoilers, especially in governance, and when you're dealing with things like corruption and quite sensitive topics, is trying to understand how the whole kind of ecosystem works before you kind of plunge in, and do work based on kind of wrong assumptions.
Of course you can.
You can ask me a question if you
No,
want.
go for it.
I think this is really interesting because I increasingly think that there's this kind of underlying force field behind a lot of these change processes, which is power, and that the job of outsiders trying to encourage progressive changes to make the power visible, and then think what processes might redistribute power in a more equal way, and especially in things like media ecosystems. Understanding how the power is distributed is actually quite difficult and needs a bit of thought and time. But then you're never going to understand everything because these are complex systems. So then the question is, how good are you at making a best guess, getting started, maybe trying lots of different things at once, like a venture capitalist, and seeing which ones go big. And actually, we work in a completely different way if you take systems seriously than if you're working in a linear way. And a lot of people pay lip service to systems thinking, but actually, I don't see many multiple parallel experiments. I don't see people mimicking evolution or venture capitalism in the way we do our work trying to influence. So I think there's some big challenges to us there.
Now, you've all talked about complexity because I'm a superficial journalist. I was wondering, do any of you have an example of a really concrete example where you could say, this is where a government has been held to account by a new kind of media or a new wave within the media in any country, in any part? Yeah.
One from Mexico. So this was to do with Mexico was chair of the Open Government Partnership a couple of years ago, and this was a international multi-stakeholder initiative. Mexico was very proud to do this and to show its credentials for its openness and transparency. One of the things they did was release a whole load of data sets about education, and that included the salaries of teachers, the numbers of teachers, where they were based, and so on and so forth. One of the organisations we supported, which is a think tank, a research organisation, basically scraped all that data, analysed it, and found that there were more than 4,000 teachers on the payroll who were claiming salaries who shared the same birth date. which was the 31st of December 1912. They also found that more than 70 teachers were paid more than the Mexican president, according to the records. So what they did was teamed up with media and basically developed and exposed their story. So, and what they did was pick a number of sympathetic media organisations, released it on the same day, and then that caused public outcry, resignations of state ministers, and a public inquiry. What they found as they further delved into the situation was that the money that was being, the ghost teachers, the money was being diverted to political campaigns at a state level. So,
if I may.
So, Louis Philippe.
Yes, I think this is a very important point. Duncan mentioned the issue of the unequal distribution of power, which is one of the core elements in the WDR, and we see how that affects effectively. But the question is, when we try to change incentives or reshape the preferences of the actors or try to enhance contestability, the role of the media is very important. And one question we asked in the report, and we built also, by the way, on a research report also published by the World Bank, led by Stuti Kemani, called Making Politics Work for Development. The question is, does information change behavior? And I think that's very, very important. It's at the core of what you are asking. So does it change the behavior of the citizens? Does it change the behavior of the service provider or the politicians? And I think what we show in the report is that it does change behavior. It changes behavior when people go to vote. It changes behavior when people get organized. But also it's very important to say that it's also a tool for bargaining among elites. It not only affects the interaction between citizens and elites, it's also a bargaining tool among elites that can help eventually lead to positive change when elites themselves are willing to introduce changes that are eventually good for better governance. I think the idea that this question of how information changes behavior is key, and also, as we mentioned in the report, and we have to take also into account, sometimes it can lead to a type of engagement that does not necessarily lead to good outcomes. So that is also the responsibility of, given that information changes behavior, how important it is to make sure that there is enough competition and provision of information that leads to the type of change in behavior that enhances the contestability and reshapes preferences in the right way.
Staying with the positive aspect of what you were just saying, is a key part of that change in behaviour people recognising that they can contest facts, they can contest what is being told them?
Exactly right. So that the point, one of the elements that we emphasize, as was mentioned before, the capacity of societies to adapt in constructive ways, is this idea of the contestation, how you limit powers to contestation. And I think the role of information, and I would insist on what we have in the spotlight in the report, is not only the availability of information, but there's the accessibility of information, and that's why how information is made public plays a fundamental role, and that is where the responsibility of the media is fundamental.
Damien, Duncan, even as you prefer to be called.
I'd much rather be called Damien, actually, much classier. I'm just slightly worried about the focus on information, because I think we're in a pre-truth or a sort of bubble here. And one of the lessons I take from Trump and Brexit is that the forces of light, progressives, whatever you want to call it, have got very, very obsessed with data and with numbers, whereas people are more interested in stories and narratives. And if we go down the path of saying media is all about access to information, we're surrendering an enormous part of the ground that actually forms norms, values, how people see the world. So, if we deal with Brexit by putting out lots of numbers out, we're going to have a very, very tiny impact compared to talking about building bridges, not walls, and a kind of narrative approach. So there's a potential risk here.
So it takes us very neatly into the second part of what we wanted to talk about, which is how can organisations like many of those that are represented in this room, in a way, influence outcomes, influence governments in developing countries? I mean, what's the answer then? If it's not sticking out numbers, putting out budgets, what is it?
I think there's a couple of difficulties about organisations coming from outside and doing this. If you buy into the fact that each location is the product of its own history, is increasingly complex and fragmented, then people coming from the outside are unable to understand it. So then you have people then sort of go in two different directions in this discussion. Either you say, we're going to focus on the enabling environment, the law, the technology, which is one role for outsiders to support that. Or the other one is going to say we have to push a lot more decision-making down to local organisers, local organisations, and we have to surrender control because we can't do this. We don't understand the system well enough. Now, I see organisations going in both different directions. I think they both have a role, and you probably need to do both.
So grassroots. Louis-Philippe, I'm going to let you come back at that in a sense. Do you accept that information isn't necessarily power? It's too simplistic to see it like that.
Oh, well, I mean, yes, I agree, but it's also important to say that we're emphasizing the role of media and communications in terms of the access to information. But I would like to also say that it's also a space for deliberation. So it's not only the access to information, but the fact that you can, in a way, it's what we call, the policy arena. In a way, what you have creating there, it has to be also a space for deliberation, so you reshape the way people think about issues. So it's not only the provision of information as you process information and you give it like already packaged, but it's also using that information to create a space for deliberation. I think that's something that should be also emphasized.
Soros.
I disagree slightly with what Duncan said. I don't see it that the media is a conduit for unedited, unengaged with information that's produced via access to information. The media, of course, is one of the main beneficiaries of a very open and vibrant access to information context. But the media and media development organizations do not just repackage those facts and numbers. They make narratives, they make stories, and then produce those stories and push them on. That's the role of the media. So the combination of an open, transparent environment where there is access to information, together with a strong professional media, that you need those two things to work in tandem. And one without the other doesn't work. So I would say that there is a symbiosis there. The other thing is, last week, Article 19 hosted a conference on fake news, and we had a psychologist who came to speak to us called Dr. Van der Linden from Cambridge University. And he made some fascinating points about the impact of information on individuals. But the one, for me, in a conversation with him that really sort of struck was, and because it was focused on fake news, of course, rather than trends of actual facts influencing actions, so do untruths, the false information influence actions, was that the sort of snippets of information that we've been talking about a lot and that we've seen talked about a lot in the media tend not to change people's attitudes, but long-term trends of information. So editorial lines set up by mass media, essentially, who pursue a certain narrative, they
drip of an agenda.
Exactly, they do change attitudes.
Stephen.
I mean, I think someone mentioned this earlier on about media being absolutely the fulcrum of power. And we all know that the first thing that goes in a coup is the airport and the radio station. It's about controlling that means of communication. Now that, of course, is breaking down in a world where you have social media and many other sort of avenues to access information. But related to that, I mean, if you think about you asked for evidence of an example where media has made an impact. I mean, look at the Panama Papers, which was a collection of newspapers and news sources working together on data and leaks. Now, where that had an impact, and this is, I think, an interesting point, is that it caused the resignation of the Prime Minister of Iceland and the resignation of the business minister in Spain. It didn't have an impact on Putin. It didn't have an impact on various other sort of military and corporate relationships and so on. So it is important, but you also need some sense of responsibility, some sense of accountability within institutions and leadership as well to make that really have an impact. But I think, to pick up on Thomas's point, I think the ongoing investigative work and ongoing analysis of stories will also have an impact over a period of time talking to the people at ICIJ who are behind the International Consortium for Investigative Journalists, behind the Panama Papers, they said that their number one searchable item at the moment is Trump. So there's a lot of work going on to look at his business interests, his links internationally and so on.
Angela, the question we talked about information, turning information into narratives. How does that work on the ground? What kind of work do you do to harness these ideas? And these...
Well, I think I was just going to say that we've been in Kenya. We've been doing governance work for the last 5 years, and I think we can all agree that the media is a powerful tool of we can use it to inform people. That's a first step. But what we also saw is that it can build people's confidence. So it's not just about information, people knowing things. It's about people knowing things. It's about people discussing things. It's about people having the confidence to act on that information. And it's about slowly changing the social norms in a society. So I think it's not just about dumping a load of information on people. That's what we've seen. Information is like a first step. Whether you think that the process is linear or organic, because we often have discussions with colleagues about whether it's a straight line or it's quite organic. I think information is just a first step. But we've seen in the research that we've done in Kenya that it's information, it's discussion, it's confidence. Some of the research we were doing in Kenya on the media, the output that we were having, the governance program, Summer Kenya, that we were producing in Kenya, is that when people watched other people question their leaders, they thought, well, that person is questioning the minister or the member of parliament. I can do that too. Actually, we should be doing it. We have a right to do it. So it's confidence. It's changing the idea in society that actually the people in power are responsible to us and they have a right to question. I think the thing that I have thought is that I think we need to link up more closely with other organizations working on the ground who are able to pick up where the media leaves off. Because one of the questions we were always asked when we were in Kenya, Summer Kenya was a factual discussion program that moved around the country and gave ordinary people a chance to question their leaders. And the question we often got when we were in field is that this is fantastic. I've never seen my member of parliament. I've got a chance to ask him a question. This issue is a burning issue for us in this area. When are you going to come back so that we can follow up? Are you coming back next week or next month or? And then it's difficult for the media to operate in that way. So I think I feel that we need to work with other organizations on the ground who will pick up where we leave off, because it's difficult sometimes for ordinary people to take that step forward when it's not, if it's about voting or attending a town meeting, then yes. But when it's about larger issues, bigger issues, then we need to be working with other development organizations. We need to be working with media houses who can pick up the story if it's a corruption issue and follow it up so that then we're kind of maximizing the impact.
Duncan.
I think some of the most interesting work I've seen in Oxfam on media and empowerment is not actually about formal power, but about informal power. It's about norms and self-confidence and empowerment. We have this really interesting program in East Africa, which started in Tanzania, called Female Food Heroes, which is a reality TV show. You just get a bunch of women farmers who describe their work on television, and then the audience votes. And it's gone viral, and the agriculture minister watches it, and the woman who wins goes around Tanzania as a kind of celebrity for the following year. And the whole point of that is to actually make women's work in agriculture visible and to change the way people understand their world. And none of that is about access to information, really. None of it's about formal power. It's a much more visceral kind of attempt to shift the way people see their lives. And I think that's often some of the best use that I've seen in work with the media in Oxfam has been around that issue rather than just the formal bit.
I'm going to be a bit miserable now. I mean, you did, to be fair, give us an example of something that didn't work. But what is the real evidence that any of this actually works? How can we measure the success apart from sort of, that kind of those stories about, oh, well, this was great, it went a bit viral? Can you measure when real change happens?
Well, you're asking the wrong person. I'm totally going to defer to Luis Felipe and to BBC Media Action. Just ask 23,000 people to find that answer. So.
Luis Felipe.
No, I think precisely what we try to show is when there has been very well-established evidence that it does change outcomes. And you have, for example, these studies, Tim Besley and others have shown when there is more circulation of newspapers in certain small towns in India, actually service delivery is more responsive to the needs. So there are many cases in which you can show that not only, as I said before, you can show that it changes behavior, but also actually you can link better outcomes in terms of service provision and so on. So to the existence of more active discussion in terms of media and so on, and more active access, more access to information. So I think as I said, with this longer-term perspective, we can see that it does play a role in terms of changing not only behavior but also outcomes. And it is important to, by the way, also eventually bring into the conversation that, as we discussed in the report, the idea of the shrinking space for civil engagement, that includes as one of the elements restrictions on media. So there are sort of formal restrictions on media that can be increasing, but also the idea that whether the market is developing in a way that makes serious journalism profitable. And that is also important, how you fund a good research that leads to better quality of media. That's also another question that matters, and how society can understand the value of this, so it can lead to also to a more sustainable model for the media, because we discussed how the media can be sometimes compromised because of the fact that it becomes not profitable. Of course, we show the famous case of Peru, where you could see what is the amount of bribes given to different actors, and certainly the most expensive actor where they spent more money was to have the media in their pocket. So the idea that you have to find ways to make the media sustainable also in economic terms, so they can be independent.
Stephen, this is something that keeps you awake at night. How can you measure success? Are you making any real difference?
Yes, of course. And like Duncan, I defer to people like BBC Media Action and others to give us those kind of examples. I mean, the things that we look for are both the way in which the organisations and companies that we support are both extending their reach. How are they increasing their audience? But then also what contribution they're making to a particular issue or problem or whatever. And it's very difficult, I think, to have pure attribution, to say that the media or our investment in Sahara Reporters in Nigeria led to this particular change in government policy. But I think you can point to breakthroughs, and you can point to breakthrough stories that are picked up by other media. You can point to changes in policy. You can point to the fact that a minister has resigned or a policy has changed, and so on. So I think we need to get a bit more sophisticated about that to try and measure the sort of the outcomes as well as the outputs. One thing that's also worth mentioning, I think, is that we talked a little bit earlier about the sort of constrictions on civic space and the way in which government clamps down on civil society, clamps down on independent voices, and clamps down on media as well. And we've experienced this as a donor in investing in a number of countries where we're not allowed to invest as a foreign organisation in media organisations because there's regulations that prohibit it. And we've also found in some countries as well that government regulation is stopping philanthropic organisations investing in media because of this idea of foreign forces and foreign influence and so on. And this particularly has happened in India. I think a counterpoint to that is where we've seen this, I think we've been reasonably successful, is that Indian philanthropists are now taking steps to support independent media. So Nandan Nilekani, for example, and people behind Infosys, Narayana Murthy and others, Azim Premji, are now starting to support independent media themselves And that, I think, is a good trend that we're seeing.
Thomas, from your point of view, then, is there a really important thing that organisations like BBC Media Action that are doing this work on the ground can do to encourage more inclusive, accountable policies for government from the perspective of someone who's championing freedom of expression in a broader sense?
Absolutely. I have to look at the media as both a community, but also then the producer of the content. At the moment, we're focusing more on the content and the impact around that. But the media itself functions as a community, and then as an element of civil society. It has a strong voice and has a great influence actually on lawmaking and policy-making processes in most governments around the world. If I can just jump back, and on the issue of impact, for like all organisations, we try and measure our impact, of course, and it's easier to measure if you think of it as a pyramid. It's easier to measure at the top. So the policy work that we do in terms of reform of legislation or passing of RTI laws and so on, that there's more of a one-to-one correlation. That's easy to both measure and to see the outcome of that in terms of the piece of legislation. The impact at that local level, so again, work that we do, tends to be very focused on specific small communities. So the impact is anecdotal. It's about individuals, changes in their lives. So you're measuring hundreds or possibly thousands of people, but not scalable in that sense. So this issue of scalability is the key one for me, and it's one that we haven't cracked yet as an organisation. But how do you take those small case examples and manage to replicate them through engagement with other actors and amplify that impact? And part of it is definitely must be around engagement with national actors, but it also needs to be around coalescing around agreed or shared models of engagement by different international actors at the same time.
Angela, before I open up to questions, one last thought really from you, which is when we talk about strategies that work, getting politicians and governments to be accountable, what for you has proved to be the most, if you like, surprising way of reaching people that perhaps otherwise wouldn't have had that connection with their own kind of authoritarian, their own state, their own politicians?
Well, I think in Media Action, we work at many different levels. We try to work at systems level and organizational level. But where we are very, very strong is at audience level. And the audience is at the center of what we do. And a lot of what we're doing is for their benefit. And in the last 5-6 years, we've been working in governance. We have done quite a lot of research that has showed us that the work we're doing, producing media programs that reach people at scale and providing platforms for dialogue and discussion and kind of constantly pushing to open up that contracting space. The research is showing us that the people who listen to our programs are actually empowered. They participate more in the civic life of their communities because they have information. Their confidence is built, so they participate more. We've seen that in many cases their behavior has changed because they will go out and vote. They'll just become more engaged in the political life of their communities. And we've also seen that governments, local authorities are more responsive. And for us, it's quite a lot. It's quite a lot focused on that, creating the demand from the ground up for open, inclusive, and accountable governments. And I think we've seen it across all the countries that we've been working in.
Fantastic. Well, that's really. I didn't expect this conversation to be quite as positive as it has been. So it's kind of rather cheering. I'm going to open it up to questions. Now, I think there should be a mic or two. Yes, there is. So if you can just say who you are and make your remarks or ask your question, but keep it reasonably brief.
Yes, hi, I'm Mark Nelson from the Center for International Media Systems in Washington. This has been a great conversation, and I think it really highlights the really important role that media plays. It's interesting that we have to have this debate in our Western societies today, because if you look across the world at what's happening in the media space, the autocrats really understand this completely. And if you look at Putin or China or whoever you want to choose, or at the oligarchs across the world who are buying media like crazy, they know this matters and they're putting gobs of money behind it. I think our problem has been not to support this at sufficient levels and to do this in a way that is really strategic and thoughtful about how we do it. I think you've outlined here some of those things, not just communication, but helping to build local media systems that are capable of accountability and tracking and keeping governments on track and making sure that people's voices are heard. And I think that we haven't really discussed that, but that is an issue that I think our societies really need to get behind to understand that this is a priority for our societies today, to figure out how to do this and to do it in a sufficient scale across the world to make a difference.
Louis-Philippe, would you say that we've been rather slow to take this up?
Well, what I would say in that respect is that structurally what we discuss in the report is the importance of having, when we talk about citizens' capacity to influence positive change, we talk about all the different instruments that should be available to citizens. So we talk about the importance of course, voting as the quintessential instrument for accountability, but we also talk about political organization, social organization, and deliberation. And what we argue is that all of them should be available because they are complementary. So throughout the long term, through in history, sometimes some of them are weaker or are weakened as instruments to change the incentives for politicians. But then others can play a more important role. So if the political organizations become less linked to the public, if there are issues with the voting or with the voting rules, always citizen engagement can play a very important role at the role of public deliberation. So our point is that all of these throughout history have shown that if all of them are available, I would go back to my original idea of how societies adapt to tensions. Tensions are a natural, outcome of the process of development, but how you adapt to those is very important, and you need to have all of them. What we say is that you cannot say that because you have one of them, you can restrict the others, because then you have you have an instrument for accountability. No, because all of them are imperfect, and all of them complement each other.
Another question.
Can I just add one thing to this conversation? Because we're only spending 0.5% of overseas development assistance on media assistance, so it's a tiny amount of money, and it's not even close to the amount that people spend on campaigns. So it's actually a really small effort on an international level.
Thank you. I'm Guy Berger from UNESCO. We do a lot of work trying to persuade governments to respect press freedom and promote media development. So I've got 2 quick points. The one is this question of evidence and impact. I think if we constrain ourselves to looking for the results of what we wanted to do, we've got a bit of a narrow perspective, because we also need to look at unintended effects. Quite often, for example, you'll get negative role models that are presented in media to discourage people, and these role models become embraced as gangster celebrities, for example. And you get critical news that criticizes people in power, then they use that to say we've been victimized by the media. And you get sponsored narratives against extremism, for example, which actually end up not having much credibility and, in fact, point to the importance of independent journalism that's critical of exactly these kind of narratives. So we need to be open, I think, to looking at some of the unintended impacts, and need to invest money, I think, in researching some things that were not expected, and be open in it. So that's my first point. Second point, I don't want to be too narrow, but I'd like to make a particular pitch for journalism's particular role in this participation and accountability. Because certainly social media with personal news and lots of communications, and certainly entertainment industry and genres like reality, these are critical resources for people, but they're not journalism. And I think journalism is distinctively unique in the way it can contribute to rational decision-making, because it's a fact-based contemporary narrative. It's a contemporary narrative that's fact-based. And you can create consensus around a currency of agreed realities that people can then take different perspectives on, but you've got something to start with. And that's critically important for what you said moderator in terms of getting discussion going across different silos. And I think that if you can have more attention to journalism as a credible factual basis and commentary based on facts, then you've got something that can not, in some cases, reinforce attitudes, but in many cases, get people's heads to start working with their hearts and working with their emotions. And then you've got more potential, I think, to make a difference. So, of course, for journalism, we need free, pluralistic, safe media, independent quality journalism. And that's not separate from what's happening in the social media because it impacts, it trickles through, it resonates and echoes in social media. But we shouldn't underestimate the importance of journalism in the mix.
Journalism, of course, faces its own pressures. We can talk about that another time. I think there's a lady at the back there that wants to make a comment on the left. I'll come back to the panel in a minute. Maybe we take 2 or 3 questions so we can get a few, and then we can have a general comment. That's this lady here, yeah, glasses.
Hi, thank you. I'm Annette Fisher. I work for Palladium, and I implement a program in Pakistan working with the media on accountability. I was really pleased to hear Louis-Philippe talk about how we need to make sure that the media initiatives that are supported have a way of being commercially sustainable and work with the way in which a media industry in a country works. And I think this is something that Pakistan suffers from enormously, and many other countries do, in the sense that eyeballs, as they call it there, are what drives the media content. If it's sexy and interesting, it's about terrorism, it's about political corruption, it's much more likely to get printed than stories on healthcare or education issues. And there's a fantastic NGO there working to change the way in which they do media development work, instead of kind of traditionally looking at how you measure success from reach and from how many people are writing stories or those kind of things. They're measuring success by saying how many or in what ways do we change interests and incentives of the gatekeepers, the editors, the producers, the media group, media house owners, and they focus a lot of their work there instead of sort of trying to get more content into the press through simply paying for that content or getting free airtime through CSR activities. They're actually working directly with these gatekeepers to say there is interest and we can prove that, and they've done some very innovative stuff engaging with key sort of big media personalities who will take up big health stories as a sort of nice thing to do, and the ratings incredibly increased for those shows, and then that was then picked up by other organisations who were then able to say, actually, this will get you ratings and it is a good thing to do. It's not just a nice to do, it's actually something you can make commercially sustainable. And I'd be interested to hear those on the panel, particularly Angela's thoughts on why do we focus so much when we're measuring success on that sort of unsustainable reach side, and why don't we look more at the people who make the decisions, and as Louis-Philippe said, to make that more commercially sustainable, maybe just accepting that sensationalism sells, so how do we work with that?
Okay, I'll take 1 or 2 more points and then I'll come to the panel to round everything up. There's a lady right at the back there and there's a gentleman at the front here.
Hi, so my name is Dietland Lunger. I'm the Communications Director for Open Government Partnership. I wanted to thank Stephen for mentioning our success in Mexico, but that came about because we had people on the ground. It wasn't an OGP, it was the fact that journalists and civil society were researching data. So that comes to Guy's point, we need to have journalists interested. How do we get journalists interested in data, in whistleblower protection, etc.? And looking at Kenya, for example, that's a country that we work in. I thought that was very interesting what you say. You go out to the field, you have one event, and then that's over. How do we get consistent coverage? I think personally part of it is through media, but how are we going to get people to talk more about the necessity of openness, perhaps as a countervailing force to what's going on in our society today?
Okay. And gentleman here.
Yeah, good morning. My name is Dario and I work with the MacArthur Foundation. One of my takeaway from the panel's discussion is the recognition of the different contesting interests behind the media space in a lot of the countries. And in spite of all this, we've also seen increasing investment towards how do you use the media to actually improve governance, strengthen accountability in countries, in spite of all of these contesting interests. And so the question, my question is, how much of current programming tools actually allows us to be able to program recognizing and responding to these different contesting interests? So we take the example of the Panama Papers, for example. We talked about the fact that that was a major point, talking about the role of the media in accountability. But I've also had conversations with people that have raised questions about how much of what has happened in the two countries that we talked about can we actually attribute as an impact of the media. So raising the question of how are we actually measuring the contributions of the media, and whether or not we are actually talking to some other groups that need to be on the table. I think the panelists from Article 19 talked about speaking with a psychologist, having a psychologist actually attend an event to speak with you. Currently, how much of the thinking that goes into programming around media actually allows us to be able to benefit from lessons from other related fields, behavioral economics, for example. There are lessons to learn. Psychology, for example, there are lessons to learn, and how much of such lessons are we currently reflecting in our programming around media to improve governance, to improve service delivery? Thank you.
I'm going to try and summarise some of those. I'll hopefully come to you. I'll give the panel, go on. I'm weak at the knees. Go on. Last one, and then we'll have a chance to answer.
Nicola Harford from iMedia. In fact, it's not really a question, it's just following on from that last point. I was really struck by, during the panel discussion, how many parallels there are between the discussions I was having around HIV/AIDS communication well over a decade ago about the need to understand the multiplicity of factors that influence people to change behaviour, that information alone, facts, are not going to do it, and that you've got to really understand and surface the sort of unwritten rules that govern the way in which people behave. And I think it's taken an awful long time to start transferring that understanding and the need to bring in sociologists, psychologists, and other disciplines to understand to the governance arena. But, it's not too late to start.
So I'm going to try and summarise, and you're all going to get very cross that I've misrepresented you, but let me have a go. Quite a lot of points then, trying to bring up this idea of bringing in different people, different ways of influencing the agenda, be it perhaps those who are the decision makers, or perhaps bringing in different kinds of thinkers, psychologists, other expertise. A little bit about the unintended consequences, perhaps of some of the work that's being done, the importance of traditional journalism in the social media environment, and the importance, in a sense, of having people on the ground and having real life experience. That's broadly how I'd summarise what we're talking about. I'm going to give you all a chance to talk about whichever aspects of that you feel are most relevant. Thomas, I'll come to you first.
Okay. So I'm not entirely convinced that people are more or less interested in different types of content than they were 10 years ago or 20 years ago. I don't think an article on health suddenly is not inspiring people, but it would have 20 years ago. I think people have generally stayed the same, but the information patterns around them have changed. But that's not to say that I do agree that there needs to be more diversity or availability of diversity in terms of content. And one thing we haven't discussed today is the presence in this marketplace of the tech giants and the social media. And that connects very clearly with both the financial sustainability and the finance model in general, but also the future of another very big question, which is around media regulation. And as we see the convergence of a print media, a broadcast media, a social media, and all these platforms start to look more and more similar, there will be a need for a new regulatory platform. And that platform, whatever it is, and whoever runs with it first, will define a lot about the financial sustainability, the content, the reach, that all these factors are up for grabs, if I can put it that way. And it's a discussion that is very pressing and urgent and needs to take place. And communities like ours need to be ahead of and setting the trend around. I completely agree about the issue of quality journalism, and people will come to the quality. So I wanted to support Guy on that. The other thing is I'd also like to follow up on the last two comments. For me, if we're doing research, it should be very much focused on the how. How are we going to improve the impact of this type of work? How do we engage with people in a more meaningful manner so that their change actions will then have more impact? And too much of the research sometimes, I feel, focuses on the if. And what I mean by that is a very kind of paternalistic kind of attitude of saying, well, in the global north, we accept that media plays a central role in governance and so on. This is the way the structures work. But in the global south, when it comes to development aid, we need proof. We need proof that you do need an independent media. Who can prove that, please? And that I think we have to move away from. We have to accept that. That is a structure that governments that invest in development have already adopted. So let's take that as the norm and let's focus on how to increase that impact.
Louis-Philippe.
Thank you. So I think it has been very clear that the role of the media to try to increase the accessibility of information and to create spaces for deliberation. I think something I would add is that, and this has been discussed not only in this WDR but also last year's WDR about the digital dividends, is that also that this cannot be a shortcut to try to improve governance by itself. It still requires that there is a response in terms of the accountability part, which is not the responsibility of the media. So in some cases, you can make information available and accessible, and people can see what's happening, but nothing happens, and that also can create frustration and can lead to a reaction that is again sometimes it's positive and it's positive change, but it can also create frustration and lead to a reaction that may not be necessarily constructive. So that element, it's important to take into account that while the media plays a fundamental role, the accountability part of it requires a more complex configuration that leads to institutional change that is not necessarily cannot be driven only by the media. But the media in the long term also, shape the beliefs and the preferences of the citizens and can create a more demand-driven type of change.
Angela.
So I just want to talk a little bit about the commercial sustainability, and thank you for that question. I think you're absolutely right. I think if you've got media houses and radio stations that are not financially sustainable, then they are more vulnerable to political or other types of co-option. So it is very important for us to support the media to be more financially sustainable, and I think we try to do that in our organization. When we're working with radio stations, we offer them all sorts of skills, value for airtime skills, and we help them to produce programs that are going to be attractive, engaging, that will drive advertising revenues. But we have to be careful, because the flip side of the coin is that if the media becomes too financially oriented, if it becomes about money, then you have a situation like we have in Kenya, where the media sector there is not a strong ethos of public service broadcasting. They are not interested in programs that are about advocating for the public interest. It's all about Nigerian movies and Mexican movies, because they know that those are the programs that will drive the advertising revenue, and therefore that's the focus. So I think it's working towards some kind of balance. It's helping media houses to be financially sustainable, so that they can resist outside political interference, but on the other hand, making sure that they are fully cognizant and recognize their responsibilities to their audience. And it's a kind of fine act actually. But I think you're absolutely right. If media houses are poor, then they're more susceptible to brown envelope journalism. I think the reach versus sustainability element is something we grapple with and we deal with every day in our work. I think there is pressure to demonstrate how many people we've reached, and and what is the impact, and quite a lot of pressure to point to direct attribution. What is it exactly that the media has done? And I think that, in my view, I think we should resist. I would agree with what you said. I think we should. There is an extent to which we need to resist the pressure to directly attribute what it is the media is doing. Because the role of the media is to mediate, it's to join the dots, it's to get people and institutions and connected. And it's very difficult to kind of pinpoint exactly what it is that the media can do, unless you're going into some very kind of scientific, random controlled tests and things like that. So I think the media is, the role of the media is to mediate, and actually it works best if we're working with all sorts of other organizations, as we have said, with governments, with non-state actors, all working together to create societies that are open and inclusive and accountable. Rather than kind of boxing up the media, and you show us what you can do. I think that's how I feel. And I think with regard to your question about journalists and how to get journalists interested and how you keep the momentum, I think you're absolutely right. I think we need to do quite a lot of work with local journalists. And get them involved. One thing that we were doing in Kenya when we were working at county level, when we were in a county, we would link up with the local radio stations, the local media houses, and get them involved, get their stringers to come in, get their presenters to come in, so that they can pick up where, once we move on from that county, they can pick up, they can do stories, they can follow up with their local leaders. But I think it is important to try and keep that momentum going with the journalists.
I've managed to crash the pits. We're well into the bulletin, but I'm going to ask you, Duncan, to get a brief response and Stephen the same.
So one, I worry that aid is also undermining commercial sustainability. I have actually launched a book in Nairobi, and people were sending me a piece of paper saying, "Can I have some money for my taxi?" while I was launching the book, which was slightly alarming, in exchange for a review. We are creating the wrong incentives as well if we're not careful. We've talked today about facts and lies. There is a massive area in between. Anything involving projections, predictions, modelling about the future is neither a fact, well, it can be a lie, but it's certainly not a fact, right? So I think let's not get too simplistic about there are journalists who tell facts and journalists who tell lies. There's an enormous contested area in between where narratives come in, where plausibility is important, where there's a whole bunch of other things going on. And final one, there are many siloed conversations like your HIV example going on right now. Everybody is moving from linear to what do we do in these complex adaptive systems in governance, in markets, in health. And there is some interconnection, but nowhere near enough. So I think we can all save each other a lot of time by getting in the room together.
Stephen.
Just two very quick points. I mean, I think picking up on Thomas's points and others about tech companies, I think increasingly Facebook and Google are becoming default news sources for many, many people. And they are also, I know, at a very senior level, taking the whole issue of fake news very seriously and fact-checking very seriously. Now, whether they can do anything about it is another question. But I think this is something which this community can also put pressure on those companies to take it seriously and to put in checks and balances as well in their algorithms and in their news sources and so on. And the second is to pick up on Mark's point about donor support to this area. I think this is something which, and I've been involved in this field for a long time, and it hasn't got any better. And I think the case that has been made for media for many, many years, and it really doesn't need to be made again. It's a very important tool. It's a fantastic tool for amplifying issues, whether it's HIV/AIDS, whether it's governance or whatever. So we should stop having to make the case. And I think it's up to donors to step up to the plate, to help in situations where you need support for investigative journalism, long-form journalism that isn't commercially sustainable. And that could be local philanthropies, as I said, in India. It could be international philanthropies as well. But then also it's up to the bilaterals as well to show leadership in this area. And I see some different people here. I'm not going to cold call them, but they also need to step up.
Give it a go if I were you.
Particularly in a situation where the US government is going to pull back from supporting this kind of area. So that's my call to action to talk that up.
Right, with that, I am going to wind up. I know I've eaten into valuable coffee time. Stephen King, Duncan, who I occasionally call Damien Green, Angela Murithi, Thomas Hughes, and Louis-Philippe Lopez-Calva in Washington. Thank you all very much for coming. Thank you for such a great conversation.
And thank you, Ursula, as well. So we have some coffee and tea, and we're going to come back together at past. We've also now resolved your Wi-Fi issue. So there are pieces of paper coming round, but otherwise, see Sophia, all right? Thank you very much.